Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have my May wrap-up. I likely will not have as many books as April, although I may be eating my words towards the end of the month because I've had a successful first full weekend in May, but it got off to a slower start. We start with The Crossroads by Alexandra Diaz. So these first 2 weeks, I am participating in the Final Book Support Group, and this book is the sequel to The Only Road. And I read The Only Road probably 2 or 3 years ago, and I absolutely loved it. I think that Alexandra Diaz did a phenomenal job with conveying everything that Jaime had to go through. And so the setup for this is Jaime is a middle school aged boy who lives in a small village in Guatemala. And in this small village there is a gang, and it's not a big gang, but it is a gang that runs the town. Runs the drug trade, runs all sorts of illicit activities. And you have to pay for protection so that the gang won't come after you. And then they do try to recruit people. And Jaime is really close with his cousin Miguel. It's like he's like a brother. And this one day, Jaime is sick and he can't go to school. And Miguel gets approached by gang members saying, "Hey, come join us." It's not actually a question. Miguel says no. And so they end up coming after him on his way home from school that day, and they kill him. And Miguel is also middle school aged. But they basically say to Jaime, "Hey, you can take his place, and Angela," Miguel's sister, so Jaime's other cousin, can become one of the girlfriends. But basically it's not a question, it's not a request. So they can do this or they can die. So the whole family gets together all of their money and sends Angela and Jaime to hopefully get all the way through Mexico and to cross the border to live with Jaime's older brother Tomas, who is living legally in the United States on a work visa. And so The Only Road deals with everything that they encounter throughout that journey. And it's a lot. It's hard hitting. There are new characters that come in that you get really emotionally invested in. And one character whose fate you don't really know for sure at the end of this book, I was hoping to encounter in this book, or at least find out what happened to that character, but you don't. I was intrigued by this book because it picks up almost immediately after The Only Road leaves off. It definitely needs to be told because, it tells the part of the story that a lot of people say in immigrant stories like this would say, oh, they're in a happily ever after. But reality is not like the happily ever after. Unfortunately, I did not end up loving this book as much as I loved The Only Road. It's not a bad book. However, you get less of the perspective with Angela, and Angela in this book does things that you never understand. Because the closeness that Jaime had with Angela in the first book, he does have nothing at all in this book. It feels almost like a return to typical middle grades books. And for that, I did end up rating it sort of middle of the road. The next book that I read in the month of May, and the second duology that I completed this month, I read Concrete Rose, which is the prequel to The Hate U Give. Everyone probably knows what The Hate U Give is about and a lot of things to do with it. I read it several years ago, and that separation actually really helped me with this book because I wasn't thinking necessarily a lot about the characters in that book. Now, the names were familiar. I remembered a little bit of the things that had happened. And I knew, obviously, because this book is about Star's father, that there would be good things that came out of it because I remembered what Star's father was like in The Hate U Give. But this book can stand on its own. It's well written. Maverick is a compelling character. The things that he goes through, the family struggles that he endures, they're very real. They're not sugar-coated, but they're not also laid bare and gratuitous. So Angie Thomas did a really good job with this book. I rated it 4 stars. The third book that I read in the month of May, and again, the third duology that I finished, Threads of Blue. Wow. This book was a gut punch so many times. I hesitated at first because it had been, again, several years since I had read the first book, and I'd read the first book because it was on the SEASL list. And I couldn't really find a summary anywhere. But the first book, I ended up remembering enough. And Suzanne LaFleur does a really good job with bringing in enough details to sort of recap the reader without doing an info dumpy recap, which is really nice. Beautiful Blue World and Threads of Blue are set in a world that feels very much like World War II London, but it's not. It's a fantasy world, but that is the only fantasy about it. There's no other fantastical elements. So very light on the fantasy. But in this world, there is a country that is taking over everything, and there is one place that is holding out on the continent. And that is Soforende, I think is how it's called. The main character in this book, Matilda, she has a best friend named Megs. She has two little sisters. They're called Big, Middle, and Little, which is adorable. The government has actually started recruiting children. They go, they take this test. Their families are given some sense of security. They're given some extra payment. And she knows that her best friend, who's super smart, is going to pass this test. So she's like, I don't want to be without my friend, so I'm going to go take this test. And she ends up taking the test, and she ends up getting selected and her friend does not. Although later, her friend does end up coming. But they're taken off to this house out in the countryside, basically, where they are doing a lot of secret war work. But also there are some prisoners of war from this other country, and she befriends one of these prisoners of war, and she's like, wait, he's not totally evil like I've always been told. And some things happen at the end of the book where, again, it was a cliffhanger, and how did I not realize it and not pick this book up for many years? I don't know. But this is a short book. It's only 200 pages, and so many times Suzanne LaFleur puts in these rich, deep, impactful statements that just catch your breath. It hits so hard, but also it's not painful to read. I don't know how to describe it, but it's really well done. I have not put this through Compile yet, but probably there's no way that I'm rating this less than a 4-star. The fourth book that I read in the month of May is The War I Finally Won by Kimberly Bradley. I picked up the first book actually because a student of mine was reading it, and she was not an active reader, but she really enjoyed it. It took her a while to get through it, but she really enjoyed it, so I thought I'm going to pick it up, and I loved it. In the first book, Ada, the main character, she was born with a clubfoot, and a mother who, it's never actually determined what it is, a mother who, through grief or some sort of other mental illness, takes out all of her anger on Ada and basically has Ada internalize that she's some sort of monster, and everyone, all the bad things that are happening to them are because of Ada, which is ridiculous. And she keeps Ada locked in this room where, that's all Ada knows. And she's only able to look outside, and her younger brother is given all of the good things, but she still loves her younger brother. Then World War II comes. Ada is determined to help them escape, to help get a better life for her brother. And she learns how to walk, even though that means that she's literally walking on her ankle because of her clubfoot, which could have been fixed earlier on. But she learns how to walk on her ankle just so they can get to this place where they would be transported into safety. Through that, she meets a woman with a lot of trauma in her own life who wasn't going to take any kids. But here's Ada and her brother. They're not accounted for on the list, and she ends up taking them in. And it's this beautiful story of found family. And it could have been a standalone. Probably would have been fine as a standalone. It's a Newbery honor. Well deserved. This book continues that story in a way that you're like, oh yeah, I want to know more about them. And there's so much more to the war than what was left off, because I think the first one ends during the Battle of Britain, which was 1939. So obviously there's so much more of the war, and there's so much more that happens to this family. Ada's finally able to have the surgery to fix her foot, but she has so much internalized trauma that she has to work with. She was never allowed to get an education. She was completely clueless as to a lot of the things in the world. And she gets to learn and experience and learn what it means to have people love her and how to love back. And it's just gorgeous. And again, just like Threads of Blue, there were so many hard-hitting parts to this book and things that happened. I'm like, no, you didn't but it's real life. It's really what happened to a lot of these different families during the war. I love the first book, and I love the conclusion to the duology. El Hospital Hostil. I accidentally grabbed book 8 instead of book 7. There was a change in publishers between book 6 and then book 7, and also I can tell a change in translator. The language, the Spanish felt stilted. It didn't read like middle grades, like what I've expected and become accustomed to. And I think a large part of that comes from the difficulty in translating a book like this, where so much of it is based on wordplay. And a lot of the wordplay does not translate from language to language. Not my favorite, and I'm becoming a little bit more disillusioned with Series of Unfortunate Events. I still enjoy them and will keep them in my collection, but they're not favorites like they used to be. Next we have Rebel, which was the last final book that I read for the final book support group round that went for 2 weeks this month. In Rebel, we pick up 10 years after the conclusion of the Legend trilogy. Now, the Legend trilogy does end with an epilogue that's set 10 years on. I say 10 years after the conclusion of the trilogy, not after the conclusion of the epilogue. It's around the same time. And the main character in here is Eden, who is Day's younger brother. They have moved from what used to be America to Antarctica. And Day is high up in, he's an agent. He's I think it's Antarctic Intelligence Service. Eden is really smart. He's apparently graduating from university, which I don't understand how this is categorized as YA when he's graduating from university. So maybe he's young, but I think he's about 18. So this feels more new adult in age of the characters, not in content. Eden has to face a dilemma because he's super smart and he's built this engine, and this person in the underworld wants to get a hold of it, wants to upset whatever system is going on in Antarctica, and Eden gets sucked into that. But you also have alternating points of view with Day. I described this in my review as fan service at its best, which I think this basically is. Everyone wanted a different outcome for Day and June. You get that in this book, which feels very rushed plot-wise. The overall problem that they're dealing with feels very simplistic. Not a bad book, but I won't purchase this one. I'll just stick with the trilogy as a whole. Next we have Persepolis, which is the first book in a duology. So I read this when I was in the mood for graphic novels. I picked up a bunch of them and then just decided to read this last weekend and loved it. A lot of people compare this to The Complete Mouse by Art Spiegelman because it is a graphic memoir and there's not many of them. They also deal with traumatic events. It's a coming of age sort of story, but set in very different areas of history. Persepolis is Marjane Satrapi's experience of the Iranian Revolution. And this is more firsthand than Art Spiegelman's because Art Spiegelman is telling the story of his father. And I really do like the art style a lot better. I really love The Complete Mouse, but I like this art style better. It's very hard-hitting. There's a lot of imagery in here that just, it hits you and makes you think. It's metaphor in visual form. I thought this was really good, and I cannot wait to get started with the second volume, which I'm not sure when I'm going to do that, but I do have my own copy of it, which I'll be reading. Now for the next three, I'm going to go slightly out of order of when I finished them. So we have one for the 9th Doctor, one for the 10th Doctor, and one for the 11th Doctor. These were the only 3 that my library had. None of them are the first volumes for that respective Doctor, which makes it a little bit difficult because all except for the 12th Doctor start off with the second half of a story that was told in a previous volume, which makes it a little bit difficult to understand. I really enjoyed the stories in the 9th Doctors. I thought they fit with the 9th Doctor. You also had Captain Jack, and you also had Rose. So this one had the actual companion in it that is also in the TV show. The one that I liked the least out of these 3 was the one for the 10th Doctor. And I was really disappointed because David Tennant, the 10th Doctor, is my favorite Doctor. His story, the one that starts it off, it's so complicated. and it brings in Egyptian mythology, but in an, obviously alien sort of way that befits Doctor Who. You had 2 companions plus someone who's involved in the situation, but I didn't understand anything about her. I didn't get to read the volume where she was introduced. It was difficult to get into it first. And then when you got to the second half, the art style changed completely, and it wasn't connected to the first story, which felt a little jarring to me because these 2 were connected in a way. They built off of each other. These 2 did not. I appreciated the second story more. It was very contained, very episodic. This one was not my favorite of the 3, which was disappointing. My favorite of the 3 is actually the 12th Doctor, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the 12th Doctor. His story felt so much like that Doctor. So he's traveling on his own, but the person in history that you have involved in it felt a lot like me, not me personally, but the character me from the TV show, which I thought was excellent. I loved their dynamic, and I loved the dynamic of the character in here, the real French woman whose name I forget how to pronounce. The 2 stories in here, they felt one-off, but they were complete stories, and I liked the art style for both. Then it took me a lot longer, 2.5 weeks, to finish this than I expected. So The Gates of Europe, it is a history of Ukraine. And going into it, one thing you need to understand is that the history of a place like Ukraine is going to be more difficult to tell than the history of, say, the United States or the history of England, because they have defined boundaries or borders. But with Ukraine and a lot of different European countries, Ukraine as itself was not defined until way later on. And so it's difficult to find where that first becomes a thing. But I think that the author, he did a really good job. And I think some of my not like avid enjoyment or why it didn't read as quick as I had hoped was because I just didn't know that much about the story. I don't have any connection with like how to say these different words either. I'm gonna put it down because it's shiny. And I think a big part of why I didn't connect with the early parts of the book also had to do with my mental state while I was reading. The author roughly divides the book up into 3 parts. The largest of the thirds of the book is the last third. And that's where you start to get the clear Ukrainian identity, which makes a lot of sense that that's the largest of the sections. I learned a lot from it and was able to draw on some ties for some of the things that are affecting this current conflict and why some of this stuff has been so fraught for so long. So the last book in this portion of the wrap-up is The Black God's Drums. So I'm pretty sure that the first that I heard of it was in one of Beautifully Bookish Bethany's wrap-ups about her readathon. And I have never been a huge necessarily sci-fi reader, but the way that she described The Black God's Drums, I was like, oh, maybe I'll pick that up. Never put it on any list, never searched for it actively, but when I went to the library to pick up some of my graphic novels, I saw it on a shelf there. I'm like, okay, I'll try it. And then it just so happened that one of the roll drops for Bookopoly-thon included a book with color in the title. There's a color. This book is so unlike what I normally read, but I really enjoyed it. So basically, I'm not going to tell much about it because it's so short. It's set in New Orleans in 1884, and the Civil War never officially ended. It went into a ceasefire after 8 years. You also have a bit of steampunk vibe, and there's also clear elements of Afrofuturism, which is not a genre that I have ever really read before. I don't know how to describe it very well, but the character has somehow always been tied with an African goddess that definitely plays a significant part in this book and how she is trying to solve the problem that they are landed in. I really enjoyed it, even though I'm not familiar with this genre at all. So for my first read from P. Djeli Clark, I enjoyed it, and I probably will pick up others of his novellas. So in this last segment of the wrap-up, I have a lot of books to talk about. Because I've read so many, also time has passed, unfortunately I won't be able to be as descriptive. So first off in this section, I'm going to talk about an entire trilogy, and that is The Livestream Trader. I love it. I have gushed in so many vlogs, 3 weeks worth of vlogs, about how much I love these books. Robin Hobb has such amazing skill with characters. You go from the Farseer trilogy, where right here, where you're just in Fitz's head. It's single person narration. You know only what Fitz knows. Then you go to the Livestream Trader series. There are so many perspectives, and that can work sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work for me. It worked in this one. She created a character in Kyle that ranks right up there with Umbridge. It's my least favorite fictional character ever. I was so happy that at a certain point in Madship, I no longer got as viscerally angry because he doesn't have as prominent of a role. The character work is phenomenal. In this series, Robin Hobb took a character on such a tremendous growth. I went from hating the character to loving them. And that character is Malta. That character arc, absolutely brilliant. Malta is so cleverly and intricately written. Also, the way that Robin Hobb describes and centers and promotes her female characters without making them the overall, they're like perfect human beings, I love. Then, on top of that, the way that Robin Hobb took threads from the Farseer trilogy, and you know, something would pop up in Livestream Traders. And if you've read Farseer and you get super excited, at least I do, you know, because that's the kind of reader I am. The way she weaves that together. Robin Hobb and her Realm of the Elderlings, I have yet to come across a book that is not 5 stars. We go from a 5-star, phenomenally written series of literature to The Sunken City. This was an arc that I got through Book Sirens. Sunken City is an indie published YA fantasy. It was such a hot mess. It was like the car wreck that you can't look away from. I kept reading, not because it was in any way good, but because I kept laughing at the absurdity of the things that were happening. The main character was orphaned and grows up on a pirate ship. Okay, but then she's a diver and she touches this like treasure and like gets super thirsty and then ends up going below the water and finding out that she's actually, I forget what the other race is, and she lives underwater. And then there's like this absurd love triangle that comes in with the person that's supposed to help her, who's the quote-unquote heir, or was until she got there, to her father, who's the king of this underworld. She gets along with everybody. She gets kidnapped and then like falls in love with the other guy, sort of. This plot is such a hot mess, I can't even describe it. And spoiler alert for a book coming later, I managed to read 2 of these in a month. But this one made me laugh so hard. It's not supposed to. And I looked at some of the other reviews for this book, and they're like 5 stars, and I'm like, oh, I love it. Did we read the same thing? I don't think so. Then we have The School for Whatnots. I've had a mixed relationship with Margaret Peterson Haddix. I have enjoyed some of her books. They've never been stellar, amazing books for me, but they've been 3.5, 4 stars before. And some of her books I just don't gel with. She takes interesting concepts for middle grades. This one I enjoyed. This one read for younger middle grades. In this situation, but this main character was born to very rich parents, extremely rich, and its mom doesn't want him to be spoiled. And so she's presented with this idea that he can go to school with whatnots, which are robots who embody children, and they don't make friends with him just because he's rich, and it's somehow supposed to be a way to keep him from being spoiled. The other main character, his best friend, is a real girl pretending to be a whatnot. And then she also finds another girl in their school who was also a real girl pretending to be a whatnot. And there's this whole system where it's a way for poor kids to get a good education, to pretend to be whatnots. There's a few things that seemed cliche for me, but this, out of all the Margaret Peterson Haddix books that I've read, I really enjoyed. So the next one I have to talk about is Mighty Jack and the Goblin King. This is the second book in the series, and I originally read the first one back in 2016 or 2017, I believe. It is a take on the Jack and the Beanstalk story. And Jack is being raised by a single mom. He has his sister Maddie, who he absolutely adores, who is on the autism spectrum, and his next door neighbor, Lily. They go on an adventure in the first one that involves the giant beanstalk and etc. Apparently at the end of the first one, Maddie gets taken by this thing, and Lily and Jack have to go to rescue her. And in this world, giants have taken over this waypoint sort of thing, and it no longer functions how it's supposed to. And in the Undercity are the goblins, and Jack and Lily end up separated. I love this story and how it unfolds. I want to read the third book in the series. However, it is a crossover with another series that the author has written, Zeta the Space Girl. So I want to read those before I read the third of the series. Next we have Crazy in Poughkeepsie. So first off, this is I think the first arc that I requested and got on NetGalley. I don't know why I didn't hesitate before selecting this based on the name. I really don't like the idea that the term crazy and the way people use it sometimes. After reading this, the way that the author talked about some things in there, nothing overtly wrong with some of the things that he said, just things that rubbed me the wrong way and gave me the impression that, I don't know how to describe it, just gave me the impression that he holds some rather interesting views, I guess we'll say. The plot goes nowhere. The plot is absurd. It knows it's being absurd though. I just didn't get the point. So the main character comes home and he finds out that his brother has come home from this expedition to find himself, bringing a guru with him, and the guru is now staying in his bedroom. And it's this weird guru who's like, are you actually a guru, or are you pretending, and are you fake? And there's another girl that gets involved who apparently is in other books that this author has written before, and they are trying to save the ghost of a whale. It's so absurd, and it goes nowhere. It's like slice of life, but absurd. I've said absurd way too many times. Next we have one that I did like, and that is Miles Morales' Shockwaves. So I have read the young adult novelization, also by Justin Reynolds, and I really enjoyed it. I love the idea of Miles Morales in the Marvel Universe and his Spider-Man. This graphic novel is a YA version and is a more recent publication, and the second book in the series is coming out this year. And I just thought it was adorable. I loved the artistic interpretation. The story felt compelling. I loved how the author is centering the earthquakes in Puerto Rico and how people aren't really paying attention to them, but obviously takes the earthquakes and put the superhero bent on it. But Miles has this connection because his mom is from, so he wants to do this fundraiser, but there's like something sinister going on and he has to figure it out. But another thing that I loved there is there's a couple other characters, I think Ms. Marvel, and I forget the name of the other one, but apparently it's this whole cadre of junior Avengers. Like there's a little bit at the end of, I think, Ms. Marvel's. I love that idea and the whole middle grade superheroes at middle school ages. I definitely will be picking up more of these. Next we have Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And I'll admit that I listened to this on audiobook in one day. It was the final prompt that I completed for Bookopoly-thon. I read it in about 4.5 hours because I was listening to it on 3 times speed. I have read The Warmth of Other Suns, also by Isabel Wilkerson. I really enjoyed Cast. There were a lot of things that struck me that I really was impacted by the way that she's describing things and framing things, but I was doing other things while I was reading, and so I don't think it had the same impact as if I had been, say, cross-stitching or something else while I was listening to it. I will say, I think it has or will have more of an impact on someone who hasn't necessarily read as much in this area. I say that because my mom is currently listening to this audiobook. She is getting into this point now where she wants to consume a lot of this information so she can learn and grow and do better. And she's amazing in the way that she really takes things in and processes things. And we haven't had a chance to really have a long run together since I've listened to this, and that's usually where we talk about these things. But she's already raving about this book and how much of an impact it's had on her. And she has discussions with my stepdad too. So I really do recommend this book. It's well written. Next we have The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. This is the graphic novel version. I really want to get to at least book 3 because the art style changes in book 3. So I think the big thing that bothered me about the art style in this book is that Percy is supposed to be 12. He looks like he's 16 or 17. Grover, I know that Grover's not supposed to be 12 because he's a satyr, but Grover is supposed to be in the same grade as Percy. Grover looks like 18 or 19 years old. It's this shaggy dude with a beard and like etc. does not look like he's 12. So I don't like the art style, but I really I love the Percy Jackson books. I love this series. I love the visual format. I just wish it was a different art style. And there were a few things, because I have read the story and I know the story, I know what's missing from it. Like the whole scene with Medusa is not in here. And I just remember that specifically from when they were traveling. I really like adapting certain things like this to graphic novels, especially middle grades books, because there are a lot of middle grades readers that are reluctant readers and have struggled with reading before. And if you engage them in something like this with the visuals combined with the words and get them reading, I am all for it. Next we have Grave Books, which is a book I read to fulfill the spooky book prompt for Bookopoly-a-thon. But I read the first book, Night Books, by this author because it was on the SEASL list. While I didn't rate it very high, I decently enjoyed it. I knew it wasn't my genre, and I knew I wasn't connecting with it. It was well written, so when I saw the sequel on NetGalley, I requested it. So Grave Books has not come out yet. I believe it comes out in August. In Night Books, the main character is taken hostage by a witch who makes him read her a scary story every night. I forget what it does for her, but he's essentially trapped there, and he's had writer's block and he hasn't been able to write anything. So he's reading through what he's already written and it's running out, and there's another girl who's also trapped there, and he realizes that lots of other kids have gone missing, and he and this other girl are not the first. And if they fail this witch, they get turned into figurines and they're trapped there forever, and he wants to go home. At the end of Night Books, obviously, they are able to defeat this witch. That's all I'm going to say. And they think that she's out of their lives forever. And one thing that J.A. White does in this is he really depicts, he or she, I don't know, they really depict the trauma that these kids would have from that experience. Like, they have a bond because they shared this experience together, but they tried to be friends, and the female main character, she broke off the friendship because she kept having nightmares. She couldn't sleep, but when she broke off the friendship, she was finally able to sleep because the main character constantly reminded her of her time trapped in this apartment. One night, the main character goes to sleep. He wakes up in a dream, and there's the witch. And there's also a graveyard. A very strange graveyard. And it turns out these are the graves for all of his lost ideas. Ideas that he never picked up and turned into stories. And to get back to waking up and out of the dream, the witch forces him to write a story. And she tells him that, guess what? You get to do this for me for the rest of time. So obviously, he's terrified of this. And the female main character also gets dragged back into this as well. And it turns out that obviously there's something else going on than what's presented at first. But I really loved this idea. I loved how J.A. White handled all of this. I loved even the stories. They weren't as that flavor of horror that I didn't like. They were still creepy. I mean, that's the whole point. This kid writes creepy stories, and that's what he's good at. I think that the way everything was combined and the way that J.A. White told the story made perfect, beautiful sense. I liked a spooky book, which is remarkable for me. I don't think that's always going to happen, but it worked for this one. Next, we have The Dream Runners. If I had finished this on the weekend of Bookoplathon, I would have been able to finish all 8 prompts. I was going to use this one for YA and water on the cover. I think the characterization is done really well. I really enjoyed learning about and following the journey of both main characters. Obviously, I have forgotten their names. Both of them have really interesting paths that are taken, and they live in Nagalok, which is where Nagas live. One of them, the male main character, he's not a dream runner, but he's one that sorts it, and he's like the apprentice to the prince who's in charge of these dreams. And the female main character is a dream runner. And so what she does is she leaves Nagalok and she goes back to our realm, and she goes through and she harvests people's dreams. And all of the dream runners have this boon that they want and they ardently desire. That's why they keep working. And for her, it's a bracelet. The dream runners are taken from tragic situations and they're given a new shot at life. And they're human. And the dreams are sold to Nagas, which is part of Indian mythology. 2 main parts that held me back from keeping this a 5-star were, one, now I was familiar with Nagas and a little bit about their mythology and Indian mythology because I've read the Arusha series. But I think someone who didn't know anything about that, if they went into this, it would confuse them a lot. There's little to no explanation of the different parts of this. The thing that did actually hold me back was the implication and the importance of dreams. It's stated, and it's for different character reactions, it's obviously understandable. The dreams are important. They're a valued commodity, but it's never explained why they are a valued commodity. And there's something that the male main character and his mentor are working on that's supposed to solve problems, and that's supposed to explain why the dreams are important. It doesn't really. Since it was such a fundamental thing, it brought it down for me. Ultimately, the bare bones of the plot, it really worked for me. The characterization was really good. I just think ultimately that piece in explaining what the dreams meant and maybe incorporating that in the mythology, I think that would have made this an amazing read. Next, we have Operation Do-Over, yet another middle grade where I have read from the author before as part of SCASL list reading. Again, like Margaret Peterson Haddix, I have enjoyed, but not necessarily loved, some of Gordon Corman's other works. But in this one, the Do-Over, the main character has a best friend, and they do practically everything together. They nurse, they love the same thing, they finish each other's sentences, etc. Then a girl gets involved, a girl comes, and they're both shocked, like, wait, she's hanging out with us? We're cool? She chooses us over the bullies? Wow. But then something happens, and then ultimately the girl comes between them. There's a bit of a dual perspective, dual timeline in here. And we go from when they're 12 to when they're 17. And they are arch enemies when they're 17. And something happens that ends up getting the main character expelled from school. And he's never been in trouble before. And he's heartbroken about this. And as he's driving home, he gets in this massive car wreck and then wakes up and he's 12 again. Immediately, he wants to fix so many things that went wrong in his life. Like how his dog died and his parents split. And obviously, he doesn't want that girl to come between him and his friend. It's really heartwarming. The way that Gordon Corman deals with all of these different things and the ramifications of the time travel and trying to fix things. Might I be screwing up anyway? I thought it was really good. Did the time travel need to be explained? Nope. Doctor Who fan here, so time travel doesn't need to be explained for me. Next we have The Best Liars in Riverview, yet another arc. So there are 2 main characters. Well, 1 main character, but 2 best friends. Again, similar to Operation Do-Over. But in these, you have Aubrey, who's the main character. Look, a name I remember. And her best friend, they are in middle school. And they're the subject of a lot of bullying. People being really rude and crass to them based on their perceived sexuality of her best friend. And she struggles with a lot of things to do with that because she's wondering where she fits in as well. The bullying gets so bad that she and her best friend make up a, like runaway plans. But she always thinks it's just like, we're doing this so we can escape and it's a way to cope with all of this bullying going on. We're not actually going to do it. But then they go camping and they're reliable enough that their parents let them go camping without adult supervision. But they get into an argument and she storms off. She comes home and then wakes up in the morning to find out that her friend never went home. And she's struggling with the fact that she doesn't want to tell a lot of stuff. She talks about lies of omission and truth that she hasn't told. There's a lot not said in the first 75-80% of the book that it's gradually revealed or not revealed that makes it really compelling to read. But then when you get to the reveals and you get to the denouement, it's like it all tumbles out at once and it gets very preachy, which I find unfortunate because I thought that the way that the author did the first 80 or so % of the book was really well done. I know that revelations would have to be made, but there was an element of preachiness and lesson giving to the end of it that just felt excessive and unnecessary. And that's what ultimately tempered my experience with the book. Then we have More Than Words. My problem in my enjoyment or my experience of this book was in expectations. I expected a memoir and I got a memoir for part of this book, but towards the about 40% mark on, it was more like a self-help and a training type book, which was not my expectation. Is this needed? What it's talked about? Yes. So the author, Kristen Anderson, I call her Kristen Hanna, and that's a completely different author. But Kristen Anderson, she was a high-ranking staffer at the Iowa State House, and she was dealing with a very toxic work environment. She was being sexually harassed at work. She made different reports about it, and nothing was done. By the time that she reached the fourth one, she was fired, basically for making the report. And she sued for wrongful termination and won the lawsuit. And this is the book that's coming out of it. I thought it was going to tell that story, and she does tell that story. But again, it gets more into a how-to, and like it shifts in tones from a memoir to a different sort of like a self-help type book, and that's not what I was looking for. Then we have the other train wreck. So on one side you have Sunken City, and the other side you have A Light. I did not expect a middle grades book based on this cover, but it read like a middle grades book written by a middle schooler. I wrote stuff in middle school. I've looked back on some of the stuff that I've written in middle school and gone, this is a published work, or a soon to be published work, and it read like it was written by a middle schooler. I've seen reviews describe this as in the style of Harry Potter or Chronicles of Narnia, and no. I mean, you've got a basic concept, magic, and I don't know where they get the Narnia thing, because like maybe the portal aspect of it, but I get the Harry Potter aspect of it, even though there's not a magical school. Ultimately, so much of this was coming here, there, the characterization, the plot was going left, and then, oh no, sharp right, and then let's go backwards, and then let's go underground and up and this, and like, where's the plot going? I did not laugh at this one. I didn't really have a great time. Should I have DNF'd? Probably, but it was a short book and I wanted to finish it. Thankfully, I had a really great book as an audiobook that I loved. Hero of Ages. Oh my word. I finally finished the Mistborn trilogy. So many words, so many things come together. Just like with Robin Hobb, the way that certain authors take these complex fictional universes and weave them together. I don't have words, and I haven't even gotten to Stormlight Archive yet in Hero of Ages. So I think I gave Well of Ascension 4.5 stars. On a reread, I probably would bump that up, but the first time through with Well of Ascension, it read like a middle book for me. It lost the thread, the overall movement of it, but everything that happened in Well of Ascension had to happen. You get to Hero of Ages and you see the things that happened in Well of Ascension and you go, huh? You're connecting that? What? So many things. And I got to the end of it and certain things happen at the end of this book that you're going, wait, Sanderson, you did what? And then he keeps going and then you're like, yes, I knew that had to be it. That had to be, that's the right thing. And I can't say what it is because massive spoilers. Okay, I will say, I love the development of Spook. Always love Spook. All the characters experienced such tremendous growth in this book. It just became more well-rounded and fleshed out, and learning all of these different things. The third type of magic and how they connect all the characters in here. I can't even say brilliant, amazing. I loved this book. So the next were all arcs that I read. So the first of those was The Orphan Keeper by Cameron Wright. This is an adaptation of a previously published work. The previously published work was for adults, and it's a novelized memoir, or a novelized biography, I should say, because the author is telling the story by the main character in the story. This is the young reader's version of that, and I think it worked really well as the young reader's version. But this boy, he was very poor, grew up in India. His father had an alcohol problem, but he really loved his family, even though it felt messed up. But he ends up getting abducted by missionaries who are rounding up orphans to sell them basically to rich white Westerners. And he keeps telling these people, I have a family. I want to go back to my family. But he doesn't get to. And he gets adopted, and they tell that story a little bit. And then there's a time jump, and then he's telling about how he ends up connecting back with his Indian roots and going back home. And I thought it was really well done. I read it in a few hours. It reads quickly. It's sweet. It's adorable. I was expecting more of a fantasy based on the cover. So the last book that I read in May is Falling Short by Ernesto Cisneros. Ernesto Cisneros is fast becoming one of my favorite middle grades authors. I don't know that I'll keep reading them because I'm moving into high school, but his book, Ephraim Divided, was one of my top 10 books last year. Falling Short, not going to make my top 10, but still really well written. In Falling Short, you have two boys. They are 6th graders. Like, this book takes place on their first day of 6th grade. They're next door neighbors, and they become friends in the most unlikely of circumstances. And they're an odd pair, too. One is super tall for his age, and he's sporty, and he struggles a little bit in school. And the other one is super short and super nerdy. Like, he loves school, he loves coding, and all of this stuff. But they are best friends, and they have each other's back. There's various things that unfold as they come of age. It's a typical middle grades book. And I just adored it. I adored both of these characters and the perspectives, the way that different things happen. And then I finished with Isaiah Dunn is My Hero. Now this was, I said it was an arc. This is not the arc. I had the arc of the second book, which was the first book that I read in June, and I'll talk about in my June wrap up. Before I read the second book, I needed to read the first book. This is a lot younger than most books that I pick up or will pick up in the future. The main character is in 5th grade in elementary school in this book, but he's having to deal with the death of his father. His father died unexpectedly on Thanksgiving, the previous November, and his mother is not taking that well. And the way that she grieves is she turns to alcohol, and there are things that happen because of that, and there are various circumstances that come up in his life that he's having to deal with through the grieving process, through the fact that they lose their apartment, they're kicked out of the motel that they're staying in. It could be really depressing, but it's really, Kelly Baptiste does a really good job in writing this book, in telling this story, and centering the narrative. I think she has a great voice for Isaiah. So there you have it. There is my very long wrap up for May. Probably should have split it into 2, but I had no idea at the beginning of the month that I would read 33 books. I'm going to skip the stats portion I read over 11,000 pages. I finished a lot of series. I read several nonfiction, surpassing, smashing all of my goals. I had such a great reading month in May, and I'm so excited. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.